The moment Brittany Mitchell felt rough fingers yanking at the delicate gold chain around her neck, time seemed to freeze in the crowded hallway of Lincoln Preparatory Academy. 300 students were rushing between classes, lockers slamming, voices echoing off the pristine marble floors, but all Brittany could hear was the sharp intake of her own breath as the chain dug into her skin. The necklace, a simple cross pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, caught the fluorescent light as it was jerked upward, pulling her slightly off balance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Sullivan's face was inches from hers, his breath hot with the smell of energy drinks and arrogance. Behind him, his two friends Jake Morrison and Dylan Pierce formed a wall, blocking the view of any teachers who might intervene. This wasn't random. This wasn't spontaneous. This was calculated, deliberate, and designed to humiliate her in the most public way possible. But what Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Brittany Mitchell had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Not this exact moment, not this specific confrontation, but the moment when someone would try to take something precious from her, try to make her feel small, try to reduce her to nothing more than a target for their entertainment. What happened next would send shockwaves through Lincoln Prep that would be felt for years to come. 3 weeks earlier, Brittany had walked through the imposing iron gates of Lincoln Preparatory Academy for the first time, her mother's old Honda Civic looking wildly out of place among the BMWs and Mercedes in the parking lot. The private school, nestled in the affluent suburbs of Riverside Heights, was everything her previous public school wasn't. Manicured lawns, state-of-the-art facilities, and students whose casual outfits cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. Brittany adjusted the strap of her thrift store backpack and touched the small gold cross at her throat, a nervous habit she'd developed since her grandmother's passing 6 months ago. The necklace was the only thing of value she owned, not in terms of money, but in terms of meaning. Her grandmother, Mama Rose, had worn it every day for 40 years, through segregation, through the civil rights movement, through raising 8 children as a single mother, and through her final battle with cancer. Before she died, she had pressed it into Brittany's palm with trembling fingers. "This little cross has seen me through everything, baby girl," Mama Rose had whispered from her hospital bed. "Now it's going to see you through too. Don't you ever let anybody make you ashamed of who you are or where you come from. You wear this proud, you hear me?" Brittany had promised, and she meant it. Even now, walking into a school where she was the scholarship kid from the wrong side of town, where her skin color and her secondhand clothes would mark her as different from day one, she kept that promise close to her heart. The scholarship to Lincoln Prep had been a miracle, the result of her perfect grades and an essay about overcoming adversity that had moved the admissions committee to tears. Her mother, Sandra Mitchell, worked 3 jobs to keep their small apartment and put food on the table, but she had cried tears of joy when the acceptance letter arrived. "This is your chance, baby," she had said, holding the letter like it was made of gold. "Your chance to get out, to be more than what this neighborhood says you can be." Mama Rose would be so proud. But walking through those halls on her first day, Brittany wondered if pride was enough to carry her through what was clearly going to be a challenging journey. Her first period was advanced placement history with Mrs. Patterson, a stern woman in her 50s, who had been teaching at Lincoln Prep for 20 years. The classroom was everything Brittany had dreamed of, filled with actual textbooks that weren't falling apart, interactive whiteboards, and comfortable chairs that didn't creak when you moved. She took a seat in the middle row, hoping to blend in while still being engaged. Mrs. Patterson called for attention and gestured toward Brittany with a warm smile. "Class, we have a new student joining us today. This is Brittany Mitchell, and she comes to us with exceptional academic credentials. I expect you all to make her feel welcome." The response was polite, but distant. A few students nodded in her direction, others offered small smiles, but most seemed more interested in their phones or the conversation they'd been having before class started. Brittany was used to this kind of lukewarm reception. Being the new kid was never easy, but being the new kid who was obviously different was even harder. It was during the transition between first and second period that she first encountered Marcus Sullivan. He was impossible to miss, standing nearly 6 feet tall despite being only 17, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to worry about anything. His uniform was impeccably tailored, his shoes were Italian leather, and he wore a Rolex that probably cost more than Brittany's mother made in a year. Marcus was holding court near the main staircase, surrounded by his usual group of admirers and wannabes. Jake Morrison stood to his right, a stocky kid with red hair and freckles who tried to make up for his lack of natural charisma by being extra loud and aggressive. Dylan Pierce was on the left, tall and lean with dark hair, and the kind of smirk that suggested he found most of the world amusing in a condescending way. As Brittany walked past, trying to navigate the crowded hallway while checking her schedule for her next class, she heard Marcus's voice cut through the noise. Well, what do we have here?" His tone was friendly enough on the surface, but there was something underneath it that made Brittany's skin crawl. Fresh meat for the Lincoln Prep grinder. Brittany kept walking, hoping to avoid whatever confrontation was brewing, but Jake stepped slightly into her path, forcing her to slow down. "Not very social, is she?" Jake said, loud enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear. "Didn't even say hello." "Maybe she doesn't speak English," Dylan added, earning snickers from several nearby students. "Or maybe she's just too good for us regular folks." Brittany felt her face heat up, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was exactly the kind of situation her mother had warned her about, the kind of test that would determine how the rest of her time at Lincoln Prep would go. She could walk away and be labeled as weak, or she could stand her ground and risk making enemies on her very first day. She chose a middle path, stopping but not engaging directly. "Excuse me," she said politely, looking Jake in the eye. "I'm just trying to get to class." "Oh, she does speak English," Marcus said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "And quite eloquently, too. Tell me, scholarship girl, what brings you to our little corner of paradise?" The scholarship comment hit like a slap. Somehow he already knew she wasn't paying full tuition, which meant he'd done his homework. This wasn't a random encounter, it was a deliberate probe to see how she'd react. Brittany straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "Same thing that brings you here, I imagine." "Education." Marcus laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Education, right. Well, let me give you your first lesson about Lincoln Prep, free of charge. There's a hierarchy here, an order to things. Some people belong, and some people are just visiting. It's important to know which category you fall into." The warning bell rang, saving Brittany from having to respond. Students began moving more quickly toward their classrooms, and the crowd around Marcus began to disperse. As Brittany walked away, she heard Dylan say something that made the others laugh, but she couldn't make out the words over the noise of the hallway. Her second period was advanced chemistry with Mr. Rodriguez, and Brittany was relieved to find herself in a lab setting where the focus was on experiments and data rather than social dynamics. She was paired with a quiet Asian girl named Lisa Chen, who seemed genuinely pleased to have a lab partner who took the work seriously. "Don't let Marcus get to you," Lisa said quietly, as they measured chemicals for their first experiment. "He does that to everyone new, especially anyone he thinks might be competition." "Competition for what?" Brittany asked, carefully adding drops of solution to their beaker. "For being special," Lisa explained. "Marcus has been the golden boy here since kindergarten. His father owns half the businesses in town. His mother sits on the school board, and he's been told his whole life that he's destined for greatness. When someone new comes in, especially someone who might be smarter or more talented, it threatens that narrative." Brittany nodded, grateful for the insight. It was helpful to understand the dynamics at play, even if it didn't make dealing with Marcus any easier. The morning continued without major incident. Her teachers were generally welcoming, the coursework was challenging but manageable, and she began to feel like maybe she could find her place at Lincoln Prep after all. It wasn't until lunch that she realized how naive that hope had been. The cafeteria at Lincoln Prep was nothing like the cramped, noisy lunchroom at her old school. It was more like an upscale restaurant, with comfortable seating areas, a salad bar, and food that actually looked appetizing. But the social geography was just as complex and unforgiving as anywhere else. Brittany got her lunch and looked around for somewhere to sit. Most tables were clearly claimed by established groups, and she could feel eyes following her as she walked between them with her tray. Finally, she spotted an empty table near the windows and made her way over, grateful for a chance to eat in peace while she observed the social dynamics around her. She had barely taken her first bite when Marcus appeared at her table, flanked by Jake and Dylan. Several other students followed at a distance, clearly sensing that something was about to happen. "Mind if we join you?" Marcus asked, though he was already pulling out a chair before she could answer. "Seems like you're eating all alone, and that's just not right. Lincoln Prep is all about community, after all." Brittany set down her fork and looked at him calmly. "Sure, it's a free country." "Free country," Marcus repeated, settling into his chair. "I like that. Very patriotic. Tell me, Brittany, what do you think about Lincoln Prep so far? Living up to your expectations?" It was clearly a loaded question, but Brittany couldn't figure out exactly what the trap was. "It's a good school," she said carefully. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here." "Grateful?" Jake echoed. "That's nice. It's always good when people remember their place." Dylan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on something around Brittany's neck. "That's a pretty necklace. Looks old. Family heirloom?" Brittany's hand moved instinctively to her throat, covering the small cross pendant. "Yes, it was my grandmother's. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Sweet," Marcus said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but sweet. "Very authentic. Really adds to the whole scholarship kid aesthetic you've got going on." The comment was clearly meant to sting, and it did, but Brittany had dealt with worse, and she wasn't about to let these privileged kids see her hurt. "I'm proud of where I come from," she said quietly. "Of course you are," Marcus replied. "And you should be. It takes real character to overcome disadvantage, to rise above your circumstances. Though I have to wonder, do you think you'll be able to keep up with the academic standards here? The pace can be pretty demanding for someone who isn't used to rigorous education." It was such a backhanded insult that Brittany almost had to admire the skill behind it. He was questioning her intelligence while pretending to be concerned about her success, making it almost impossible for her to respond without seeming defensive. "I think I'll manage," she said simply. "I'm sure you will," Marcus said, standing up as suddenly as he'd sat down. "Well, this has been enlightening. Welcome to Lincoln Prep, Brittany. I have a feeling you're going to fit right in." As he walked away with his entourage, Brittany realized that what had just happened wasn't really a conversation. It was an evaluation, a test to see how she would respond to pressure. And while she felt like she'd held her ground reasonably well, she also knew that this was just the beginning. The rest of the week followed a similar pattern. Marcus and his friends would appear at random moments, always when teachers weren't looking, always with comments that walked the fine line between casual conversation and obvious harassment. They never did anything overtly threatening or clearly inappropriate, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. They wanted her to know that she was being watched, evaluated, and judged. It was during her second week that the incidents began escalating. Her locker was found open one morning, books scattered on the floor. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. Someone wanted her to know they could get to her things whenever they wanted. A few days later, she found a note slipped into her chemistry textbook. "Some people just don't belong," it read in neat handwriting. "Maybe it's time to consider other options." Brittany kept the note, just as she documented every other incident in a small journal she'd started carrying. Her mother had taught her to keep records of everything, a lesson learned from years of dealing with landlords and employers who tried to take advantage of people who couldn't afford lawyers. "If someone's treating you wrong, baby, you write it down," Sandra had always said. "Date, time, witnesses, everything. Because when push comes to shove, it's your word against theirs, and they're going to have better lawyers." The harassment was subtle but persistent. Her textbooks would go missing and turn up in strange places. Her lunch would be accidentally knocked over. Other students would whisper just loud enough for her to hear comments about affirmative action and diversity quotas. But it was the incident with her gym clothes that really crossed a line. Brittany had always been athletic, and physical education was one of the classes where she felt most confident. She was faster than most of the other girls, stronger than many of them expected, and her coordination was excellent thanks to years of informal martial arts training with her uncle. Uncle Jerome was Sandra's younger brother, a former Marine who had learned various fighting disciplines during his service. He'd been teaching Brittany basic self-defense since she was 10, not because he expected her to get into fights, but because he believed every young woman should know how to protect herself. "The world ain't always kind to girls who look like you, baby girl," he'd told her during one of their weekend training sessions in the park. "And it's especially hard on girls who are smart and ambitious and refuse to make themselves small. You need to know how to handle yourself if things get ugly." Brittany had enjoyed the training more than she'd expected. There was something satisfying about the precise movements, the discipline required, and the confidence that came from knowing she could defend herself if necessary. Uncle Jerome had started her with basic techniques, then moved on to more advanced throws and holds as she got older and stronger. "Judo's good for someone your size," he'd explained. "It's not about being the biggest or the strongest, it's about using your opponent's size and momentum against them. The bigger they are, the harder they fall." But Brittany had never expected to need those skills at school. Lincoln Prep was supposed to be a place of learning and opportunity, not a place where she'd have to worry about physical confrontations. That illusion was shattered on a Wednesday afternoon when she went to her gym locker to change after physical education class. Her clothes were gone. Not misplaced, not fallen to the floor, but completely missing. In their place was a note that made her blood run cold. "Maybe you should just go back where you came from. Some people don't belong in nice places." Brittany stood in the empty locker room, wearing only her gym clothes, with no way to change back into her uniform. The final bell had already rung and she was supposed to be at her last period class in 5 minutes. She looked around desperately, hoping her clothes had just been moved somewhere else, but deep down she knew this was deliberate. She ended up having to go to the office to call her mother for a change of clothes, explaining to the secretary that there had been a misunderstanding with her locker. The humiliation of having to ask for help, of being unable to solve the problem herself, burned almost as much as the harassment itself. That evening, Brittany sat at the small kitchen table in their apartment while her mother heated up leftover takeout from Sandra's job at a downtown restaurant. The apartment was tiny but spotless, decorated with family photos and her grandmother's quilts. Mama Rose's presence was everywhere, from the small shrine Sandra had set up on the mantelpiece to the smell of the lavender sachets she used to keep in her dresser drawers. "How was school today, baby?" Sandra asked, the same question she asked every day. Brittany almost told her everything, almost described the constant low-level harassment, the missing clothes, the feeling of being watched and judged every moment of every day. But she knew what would happen if she did. Her mother would march into that school demanding action, and things would get worse. They always got worse when parents got involved, because then the harassment went underground, became more subtle, more difficult to prove. "It was fine, Mama," she said instead, just adjusting to everything. Sandra wasn't fooled. She'd worked too many years in service jobs, dealt with too many difficult customers and unreasonable managers, not to recognize when someone was trying to maintain their dignity in an impossible situation. "Brittany Nicole Mitchell," she said, using her full name the way she always did when she was serious. "I didn't work 3 jobs to send you to that fancy school so you could come home looking like somebody stole your lunch money. What's happening over there?" Brittany looked up at her mother, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged from another 12-hour day of serving people who looked right through her. Sandra was only 35, but she looked older, worn down by years of struggle and sacrifice. The last thing she needed was to worry about her daughter's problems on top of everything else. "Just typical new kid stuff," Brittany said, forcing a smile. "Some of the students are a little territorial, but I can handle it." Sandra studied her daughter's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're strong, baby. Stronger than you know. But don't try to handle everything by yourself, you hear? That's what family's for." "I know, Mama." But Brittany wasn't sure she did know. She was beginning to understand that strength meant different things to different people, and what worked in her old neighborhood might not work at Lincoln Prep. The rules were different here, the stakes were higher, and the consequences of making the wrong move could affect not just her, but her family's entire future. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her grandmother's cross warm against her skin. She thought about Mama Rose, about all the things she'd endured and overcome. Segregated schools, discrimination, poverty, single motherhood, and finally cancer. Through it all, she'd maintained her dignity, her faith, and her determination to make things better for the next generation. "You're stronger than you know," Mama Rose used to say when Brittany was little, and facing some childhood crisis. Strong enough to bend without breaking, smart enough to pick your battles, and brave enough to stand up when it matters most. The question was, when did it matter most? When was it time to stop bending and start standing? Brittany had a feeling she was going to find out soon. The next few days brought an escalation in the harassment that made it clear Marcus and his friends were growing bolder. Her books were accidentally knocked out of her hands in the hallway. Her lab experiments were sabotaged just enough to ruin her results, but not enough to be obvious. Anonymous notes appeared in her locker with increasing frequency, each one a little more threatening than the last. But it was what happened in the cafeteria on Friday that pushed things to a new level entirely. Brittany was sitting alone, as had become her habit, when she noticed Marcus and his crew approaching with more people than usual. Not just Jake and Dylan, but several other students who normally wouldn't give her a second glance. It was like they were building an audience for whatever was about to happen. "Brittany!" Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the cafeteria. "Just the person I was looking for." She looked up warily as they surrounded her table. "What do you want, Marcus?" "Want? I don't want anything. I'm here to make you an offer." He gestured grandly, like a game show host revealing a prize. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about how grateful you are to be here, and I realized that maybe we got off on the wrong foot." Brittany said nothing, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "I've been watching you, and I think you might have potential. Real potential. With the right guidance, the right connections, you could actually make something of yourself here." "I'm already making something of myself," Brittany replied quietly. "Of course you are," Marcus said with a patronizing smile. "But imagine how much more you could accomplish with the right support. I'm talking about tutoring from the best students, introductions to the right families, recommendations for summer programs. The kind of opportunities that money can't buy." Brittany felt a chill run down her spine. "And what would I have to do for these opportunities?" Marcus's smile widened. "Nothing too difficult. Just acknowledge reality. Accept that there are certain social hierarchies here, certain ways of doing things that have worked for generations. Show a little humility, respect for tradition." The euphemisms were paper-thin. He wanted her to know her place, to accept second-class status in exchange for the privilege of attending Lincoln Prep, to smile and nod and be grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance they decided to throw her way. "I think I'll pass," Brittany said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. Marcus's expression hardened for just a moment before the fake smile returned. "That's disappointing. I was hoping you'd be smarter than that." "I am smart," Brittany said, standing up from her chair. "Smart enough to recognize a threat when I hear one." The cafeteria had grown quiet around them, other students sensing the tension and turning to watch. Marcus looked around at his audience, then back at Brittany with something that might have been respect if it wasn't so clearly hostile. "Threat? Who said anything about threats? I'm just trying to help you understand how things work around here." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "But if you want to do this the hard way, that's your choice. Just remember, you brought this on yourself." As he walked away with his entourage, Brittany remained standing by her table, her heart pounding with adrenaline and fury. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, could hear the whispered conversations starting up around the room. Whatever protection her newness had provided was officially over. The gloves were coming off. That weekend, Brittany found herself back in the park with Uncle Jerome for their regular training session. She hadn't told him about the escalating situation at school, but he could sense her tension in the way she moved, the extra aggression in her throws. "Something's eating at you, baby girl," he said after she'd thrown him particularly hard during a practice round. "You want to talk about it?" Brittany sat on the grass, catching her breath and trying to decide how much to share. Uncle Jerome had always been her confidant, the one person who understood her ambition and her frustration with the world's limitations. "There are some kids at my new school who don't think I belong there," she said finally. Uncle Jerome nodded slowly. "And how are they expressing this opinion?" "Small stuff, mostly. Missing books, nasty notes, comments about scholarships and affirmative action. But it's getting worse." "Any of them put their hands on you?" "Not yet. But you think they might?" "I think they're building up to something." The leader, this kid Marcus. He basically threatened me yesterday. Made it clear that I could either accept their version of how things should be or face the consequences. Uncle Jerome was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city skyline visible beyond the park. You know what your grandmother would have said about this? What? She would have said that some fights choose you, whether you want them or not. And when that happens, you've got two choices. You can run away and let them define who you are, or you can stand your ground and define yourself. But what if standing my ground ruins everything? What if I lose my scholarship? Baby girl, if they can take your scholarship away for defending yourself, then it wasn't really yours to begin with. But if you let them break your spirit, if you let them make you ashamed of who you are, then you've lost something that no scholarship can replace. They trained harder that day than they had in months. Uncle Jerome put Brittany through a series of scenarios, teaching her how to break free from various grabs and holds, how to use an attacker's momentum against them, how to end a confrontation quickly and decisively. Remember, he said as they finished up, the goal is never to hurt someone. It's to protect yourself and get to safety. But if someone puts their hands on you, if they try to take something that belongs to you, you have every right to defend yourself. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray, overcast sky that seemed to match Brittany's mood. She walked through the gates of Lincoln Prep with a sense of foreboding, like she was walking into a trap that had been carefully set over the past 3 weeks. Her first few classes passed without incident, but she could feel the tension building throughout the day. Other students looked at her differently now, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. The social lines were being drawn, and everyone was choosing sides. It was during the transition between third and fourth period that everything finally came to a head. Brittany was walking through the main hallway, her books clutched tightly against her chest, when she noticed Marcus and his crew positioned strategically near her locker. They weren't even pretending to be casual about it anymore. As she approached, Marcus stepped directly into her path, forcing her to stop. Jake and Dylan flanked her on either side, while several other students formed a loose circle around them, blocking the view from the main office. "Well, well," Marcus said, his voice loud enough to carry to the gathered crowd. "If it isn't our scholarship princess, how are you adjusting to life at Lincoln Prep? Finding your place in the social hierarchy?" Brittany kept her voice level. "I'm just trying to get to class, Marcus." "Class, right. Education is so important, isn't it? Though I have to wonder if you're really getting the full Lincoln Prep experience. You seem so isolated, so disconnected from school traditions." "What traditions?" Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, for instance, there's a long-standing tradition here that new students show respect to those who came before them. A kind of tribute, if you will." Brittany felt her stomach drop. What kind of tribute? Nothing too demanding, just a small gesture of acknowledgement. Something personal, something that shows you understand your place here. His eyes dropped to her neck, fixing on the small gold cross that hung there. "That's a pretty necklace. Very meaningful, I'm sure." The implication was crystal clear, and Brittany felt a surge of protective fury that almost took her breath away. Her hand moved instinctively to cover the pendant, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. "Don't you ever let anybody make you ashamed of who you are or where you come from." "My necklace isn't for sale," Brittany said quietly. "Sale?" Marcus laughed, looking around at his audience. "Who said anything about selling? I'm talking about sharing. Community spirit, the kind of gesture that shows you're really committed to being part of the Lincoln Prep family." "No." The word hung in the air like a challenge. The hallway had grown quieter, other students sensing that something significant was happening and gathering to watch. Marcus's expression hardened. "No? That's unfortunate. I was hoping you'd be more reasonable." "I'm being perfectly reasonable. My grandmother's necklace stays with me." "Your grandmother?" Marcus said the words like they tasted bad. "Dead people don't need jewelry, Brittany. But living people need to understand their place in the world." The insult to Mama Rose's memory hit Brittany like a physical blow, and she felt something shift inside her chest, a cold fury that settled in her bones like ice. But she kept her voice calm, controlled. "Walk away, Marcus. This doesn't have to get ugly." "Ugly?" Marcus stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that made several nearby students shift uncomfortably. "The only thing that's ugly here is your attitude. You come into our school, take a spot that should have gone to someone who actually belongs here, and then you have the nerve to disrespect our traditions?" "I haven't disrespected anything. Haven't you?" Marcus reached out suddenly, his fingers closing around the delicate gold chain at her throat. "Because this looks like disrespect to me." And there it was. The moment Uncle Jerome had prepared her for. The moment Mama Rose had warned her about. The moment when someone finally crossed the line from psychological harassment to physical assault. Brittany felt the chain pull tight against her neck as Marcus's grip tightened, felt the pendant bite into her skin as he yanked upward. Time seemed to slow down, the way it did in movies when everything important was about to happen. She could see Marcus's face clearly, the mixture of arrogance and cruelty that twisted his features. She could see Jake and Dylan moving closer, ready to back up their leader if things got out of hand. She could see the crowd of students watching, some with their phones out, recording everything. But most clearly of all, she could see the choice in front of her. She could let Marcus take her grandmother's necklace, let him win this confrontation, and establish himself as someone who could take whatever he wanted from her whenever he chose. She could accept the role they wanted to force on her, the grateful scholarship kid who knew her place and never caused trouble. Or she could fight back. The decision was easier than she'd expected. In the end, it wasn't really a decision at all. It was just who she was, who Mama Rose had raised her to be, who Uncle Jerome had trained her to become. Marcus was still pulling on the chain, still speaking, still playing to his audience, when Brittany moved. The technique was one Uncle Jerome had drilled into her hundreds of times. Grab the wrist of the hand that's holding you, step to the side to break their balance, use their own momentum to complete the throw. It happened faster than anyone expected, including Marcus. One moment he was standing there with his hand around her necklace, confident in his physical dominance and social position. The next moment he was flat on his back on the marble floor, staring up at the ceiling with a look of complete shock on his face. The hallway went dead silent. 300 students stopped talking, stopped walking, stopped breathing. Even the usual background noise of locker doors and sneakers on marble seemed to pause in recognition of what had just happened. Brittany stood over Marcus, her books scattered around them, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Her grandmother's necklace hung safely around her neck, the chain intact, the cross catching the light as it settled back into place over her heart. "Don't," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "ever put your hands on me again." Marcus Sullivan lay on the cold marble floor of Lincoln Preparatory Academy's main hallway, staring up at the ornate ceiling that his family's donation had helped install 15 years earlier. The silence that followed his impact with the ground was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could hear the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights above, could hear what sounded like someone taking a picture with their phone. The reality of what had just happened hit him in waves. First came the physical shock, the ache in his back where he'd hit the floor, the sting to his pride that hurt worse than any bruise. Then came the social implications, the devastating realization that he, Marcus Sullivan, heir to the Sullivan family fortune and undisputed king of Lincoln Prep's social hierarchy, had just been thrown to the ground by a scholarship student in front of half the school. Jake Morrison and Dylan Pierce stood frozen beside him, their mouths hanging open like they were catching flies. Neither of them moved to help him up, too stunned by the speed and efficiency of what they'd witnessed to process how they should react. Around them, the circle of students who had gathered to watch what they'd expected to be Marcus's easy humiliation of the new girl now stared in complete disbelief. Brittany Mitchell remained standing exactly where she'd been when the confrontation started, her dark eyes steady and calm as she looked down at Marcus. Her grandmother's cross necklace caught the hallway lights, glinting gold against her school uniform, untouched and unmoved from where it belonged. Her books lay scattered around them both, but she made no move to collect them, maintaining her position like a sentinel guarding something precious. "Are you going to get up?" she asked quietly. "Or do you need me to call the nurse?" The question was delivered without malice, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse than any taunt or threat could have been. Marcus felt his face burn with humiliation, as he realized that she wasn't even breathing hard. wasn't showing any signs of the adrenaline rush that should have followed such a confrontation. She had thrown him with the casual efficiency of someone taking out the trash. "You psycho!" Jake finally found his voice, taking a step toward Brittany with his fists clenched. "You can't just attack people." Brittany's eyes shifted to Jake, and something in her expression made him stop mid-stride. "He grabbed my necklace first," she said simply. "I defended myself." "There's a difference." "That's assault!" Dylan protested, though he made no move to get any closer to her. "You could be expelled for this." "Could I?" Brittany's tone remained calm, almost curious. "For defending myself against someone who put their hands on me without permission? I guess we'll find out." Marcus finally struggled to his feet, his designer uniform wrinkled, and his perfectly styled hair disheveled. The physical humiliation was bad enough, but the psychological impact was devastating. In the space of 30 seconds, his carefully cultivated image as someone untouchable, someone to be feared and respected, had been shattered completely. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking with rage and embarrassment. "You have no idea what you've just done to yourself." Brittany tilted her head slightly, studying his face with what appeared to be genuine interest. "What have I done to myself, Marcus? Stood up to a bully? Refused to let someone steal from me? Protected something that belonged to my grandmother?" The casual use of his first name, without any hint of deference or fear, was another small knife wound to his ego. Everyone at Lincoln Prep treated him with a certain level of respect, even if it was motivated by fear rather than genuine admiration. But this girl, this scholarship student from whatever poor neighborhood she'd crawled out of, was looking at him like he was just another teenager having a tantrum. "You don't understand how things work here," Marcus said, trying to regain some sense of authority. "My family built this school. My father sits on the board of directors. One phone call and you'll be back in whatever public school hellhole you came from." For the first time since the confrontation began, Brittany's expression changed, not to fear or regret, as Marcus had hoped, but to something that looked almost like pity. "Your family built this school," she repeated slowly. "And you think that gives you the right to put your hands on other students? To steal their belongings? To threaten and intimidate anyone who doesn't bow down to you?" The questions hung in the air between them, and Marcus realized with growing horror that other students were nodding along with her words. The audience that had gathered to watch his easy victory was now looking at him with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disgust. "I wasn't stealing anything," he protested weakly. "It was just a joke." Grabbing someone's necklace and threatening to take it as a joke? Brittany's voice carried clearly across the hallway, ensuring that everyone could hear her response. "Putting your hands around someone's throat is funny to you?" The word throat hit like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't thought about it in those terms, hadn't considered how his grab for her necklace might have looked to observers, but as he glanced around at the faces surrounding them, he could see that's exactly how it had appeared. He had put his hands on a female student's neck, and she had defended herself. "That's not what happened," he said desperately. "I was just trying to—" "To what?" Brittany interrupted. "To teach me my place? To show me that you could take whatever you wanted from me whenever you felt like it? To prove that being rich and white and male means you don't have to respect other people's boundaries?" Each question was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through his protests and exposing the ugly truth underneath. Marcus looked around frantically for support from his friends, from the crowd, from anyone who might help him regain control of the narrative, but Jake and Dylan were backing away slowly, clearly wanting to distance themselves from what was becoming a public relations disaster. The other students were pulling out their phones, some recording the aftermath, others already posting about what they'd witnessed. "You're twisting everything," Marcus said, his voice rising with panic. "These people know me. They know I'm not some kind of monster." "Do they?" Brittany bent down to collect her scattered books, moving slowly and deliberately. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like they just watched you assault a female student and then try to blame her for defending herself." The word assault hit Marcus like a slap. In his mind, he'd been establishing dominance, putting the scholarship girl in her place, maintaining the natural order of things. But stripped of the context he'd created in his own head, his actions looked exactly like what Brittany was describing. He had grabbed a female student by the neck and tried to take her jewelry. No amount of social status or family wealth could make that look good. Principal Harrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What is going on here?" Dr. Elizabeth Harrison was a formidable woman in her 50s who had been running Lincoln Prep for nearly a decade. She was tall and imposing, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of presence that could silence a room full of teenagers with a single look. She had navigated the complex politics of managing a school filled with the children of the wealthy and powerful, but she was also known for her fairness and her refusal to let money influence her decisions when it came to student safety. The crowd of students parted as she approached, several of them quickly shoving their phones into their pockets. Marcus felt a surge of relief at her arrival, confident that surely an adult in authority would see through whatever narrative Brittany was trying to create. "Principal Harrison," he began, putting on his most respectful voice, "there's been a misunderstanding. This new student attacked me for no reason." Dr. Harrison's eyes moved from Marcus to Brittany, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had dealt with countless teenage conflicts. She noticed Marcus's wrinkled uniform and disheveled appearance, noted the calm way Brittany stood holding her books, observed the way the crowd seemed to be positioned as if they'd been watching some kind of confrontation. "Is that what happened?" she asked, her voice neutral but carrying an undertone that suggested she'd already made some preliminary judgments. "No, ma'am," Brittany replied respectfully. "Marcus grabbed my necklace and tried to take it from me. I defended myself." "She's lying," Marcus protested. "I barely touched her, and she threw me to the ground like some kind of maniac." Dr. Harrison held up a hand for silence, then looked around at the gathered students. "Did anyone else witness what happened here?" There was a moment of hesitation as students glanced nervously between Marcus and the principal. Everyone knew that crossing the Sullivan family could have consequences, but they'd also just watched something that was impossible to ignore or reframe. A sophomore named Ashley Chen stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly as she held up her phone. "I recorded most of it," she said quietly. Marcus grabbed her necklace first. She was just trying to get to class. Dr. Harrison extended her hand for the phone, and Ashley reluctantly handed it over. The principal's face remained impassive as she watched the short video, but Marcus could see something shift in her expression as she took in what had actually happened. "Mr. Sullivan," she said when the video ended, "you grabbed Ms. Mitchell's necklace without her permission?" Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. "It wasn't like that. I was just trying to make a point about school traditions and—" "You put your hands on another student's personal property," Dr. Harrison interrupted, "and when she defended herself, you fell down." The clinical way she described the incident made Marcus realize how weak his position had become. Stripped of all the social context and power dynamics he'd been trying to leverage, his actions looked exactly like what they were: assault. "My father will hear about this," he said desperately, playing the only card he had left. "He won't stand for his son being attacked by some scholarship kid." The threat hung in the air for a moment before Dr. Harrison responded, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that made several students take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Sullivan, are you threatening me? Are you suggesting that your father's position on the board should influence how I handle a clear case of one student assaulting another?" Marcus realized too late that he'd made a critical error. By invoking his father's influence, he'd essentially admitted that he expected special treatment based on his family's wealth and connections. And he'd done it in front of dozens of witnesses who were recording everything. "That's not what I meant," he backtracked frantically. "I just think there's been a misunderstanding here." "The only misunderstanding," Dr. Harrison replied coldly, "is your apparent belief that your family's money gives you the right to put your hands on other students." "Ms. Mitchell, are you injured?" Brittany touched her throat where the chain had pulled tight when Marcus grabbed it. "Just a little sore, but I'm fine." "Do you want to press charges?" The question sent a shock through the crowd. The idea that a student might actually face legal consequences for bullying was almost unthinkable at Lincoln Prep, where problems were usually handled quietly and internally to avoid bad publicity. Brittany considered the question seriously, looking at Marcus with what appeared to be genuine deliberation. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," she said finally. "If that means pressing charges, then yes." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Criminal charges would mean lawyers, court appearances, and worst of all, public records that couldn't be bought or buried. His dreams of attending an Ivy League university, of following in his father's footsteps, could be destroyed by a single moment of stupidity. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake. I'm sorry." But it was too late for apologies. Dr. Harrison was already reaching for her radio to call security, and several students were backing away from Marcus like he was radioactive. The social isolation that had begun the moment he hit the floor was now complete and total. "Mr. Sullivan, you'll be coming with me to the office," Dr. Harrison announced. "Ms. Mitchell, I'll need you to come as well to give your statement. Everyone else, please disperse and get to your classes immediately." As the crowd began to break up, Marcus caught fragments of whispered conversations that made his stomach churn. "Did you see how fast she moved? He totally deserved that. About time someone stood up to him. My mom is going to hear about this." The last comment made him realize that the story wouldn't stay contained within the school walls. Parents would hear about it at dinner that night. Board members would get phone calls. And by tomorrow morning, everyone in their affluent community would know that Marcus Sullivan had been humiliated by a scholarship student in front of half the school. As they walked toward the administrative offices, Marcus tried one last desperate appeal to Brittany. "Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot," he said, his voice pleading. "But this doesn't have to ruin both our futures. We can work something out." Brittany stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What exactly are you proposing, Marcus?" I could help you. Introduce you to the right people, make sure you fit in here. My family has connections at all the best colleges. We could make sure the scholarship thing works out for you." It was the same offer he'd made in the cafeteria, dressed up in slightly more desperate language, but Brittany's response was exactly what he should have expected by now. "I don't need your help to fit in," she said calmly. "I don't need your family's connections to succeed. And I definitely don't need to make deals with someone who thinks putting their hands on other people is acceptable behavior." Dr. Harrison, who had been listening to the exchange with growing disgust, shook her head. "Mr. Sullivan, you're only making this worse for yourself. I suggest you save your energy for explaining your actions to your parents and possibly the police." The word police hit Marcus like a physical blow. This was really happening. His carefully constructed world of privilege and immunity was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In the principal's office, the full scope of Marcus's predicament became clear. Dr. Harrison pulled up his disciplinary record, which showed a pattern of minor infractions that had been overlooked or minimized over the years. Comments from teachers about his attitude toward female students and minority classmates painted a picture of someone who had been enabled and protected for far too long. "Mr. Sullivan," Dr. Harrison said, reviewing the file, "this isn't your first incident involving inappropriate behavior toward other students. It's simply the first time there's been clear video evidence." Marcus slumped in his chair, realizing that his past was now working against him. All those times he'd gotten away with smaller transgressions, all those instances where his family's influence had made problems disappear, were now being used to establish a pattern of behavior. Meanwhile, Brittany sat calmly in the chair beside him, answering Dr. Harrison's questions with the same composed dignity she'd shown throughout the entire confrontation. She described the weeks of harassment leading up to the incident, the missing books and nasty notes, the constant pressure to know her place in the school's social hierarchy. "Why didn't you report any of this earlier?" Dr. Harrison asked. "I documented everything," Brittany replied, pulling out a small notebook from her backpack. "Dates, times, witnesses when there were any. But I wanted to try to handle it myself first. I hoped it would stop on its own." Dr. Harrison flipped through the notebook, her expression growing darker with each page. The level of detail was impressive and damning, showing a clear pattern of escalating harassment that culminated in physical assault. "This is extensive documentation," the principal said. "You've been keeping detailed records for weeks." "My mother taught me to write everything down," Brittany explained. "She said that when you don't have money for lawyers, you better have good records." The comment highlighted the class differences that had been at the heart of the conflict all along. While Marcus had grown up assuming that problems could be bought away or influenced out of existence, Brittany had been raised to prepare for a world where she'd have to fight for everything she got. Dr. Harrison closed the notebook and looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Sullivan, given the evidence presented here, I'm suspending you immediately pending a full investigation. You'll also be banned from all school activities and events until this matter is resolved." Marcus felt his world collapse completely. Suspension would go on his permanent record, affecting his college applications and future prospects. The ban from activities meant he'd missed the state championship game he'd been training for all season, potentially costing him athletic scholarships as well. "This is insane," he protested weakly. "My father won't stand for this." "Your father," Dr. Harrison replied icily, "will be here within the hour to discuss his son's behavior and the school's response to it. I suggest you use that time to consider whether you want to show remorse for your actions or continue making threats." As if summoned by her words, the office phone rang with news that Richard Sullivan had arrived and was demanding to see his son immediately. Dr. Harrison's secretary sounded nervous as she relayed the message, clearly aware of the storm that was about to descend on the administration. "Send him in," Dr. Harrison said calmly, though Marcus could see her steel herself for what was coming. Richard Sullivan burst through the office door like a force of nature, his expensive suit and commanding presence filling the room with barely contained rage. He was a larger, older version of Marcus, with the same blonde hair now silver at the temples, and the same sense of entitlement that seemed to radiate from every pore. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "I get a call that my son has been attacked by some student, and now I'm told he's being suspended?" Dr. Harrison remained seated, a power move that clearly frustrated Richard Sullivan. "Your son assaulted another student, Mr. Sullivan. There's video evidence and multiple witnesses." "Assaulted?" Richard's voice rose to a near shout. "He's 17 years old. What kind of assault could he possibly commit?" Without a word, Dr. Harrison turned her computer monitor around and played Ashley Chen's video. The room fell silent as they watched Marcus grab Brittany's necklace, heard his threats about taking it as tribute, and saw Brittany's swift defensive response. When the video ended, Richard Sullivan's face had gone through several color changes. The anger was still there, but it was now mixed with the dawning realization that his son had been caught on camera doing something indefensible. "That's not assault," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "That's just kids being kids." "Kids being kids?" Brittany spoke for the first time since Richard had entered the room, her voice carrying a note of steel that made everyone turn to look at her. "Would you call it kids being kids if someone grabbed your wife's necklace and threatened to take it?" Richard Sullivan stared at her, clearly unused to being challenged by a teenager, especially one who didn't share his social class or skin color. "This is different," he said weakly. "How is it different?" Brittany pressed. "Because I'm black? Because I'm on scholarship? Because you think I should be grateful for whatever treatment I receive here?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Richard Sullivan found himself in the same position his son had been in earlier, trying to defend the indefensible without sounding like a complete bigot. "Now listen here," he began, but Dr. Harrison cut him off. "No, Mr. Sullivan, you listen. Your son grabbed another student's necklace without permission, made threats about taking her personal property, and put his hands around her throat in the process. That's assault, and it's on video. The only reason we're not calling the police right now is because Ms. Mitchell has agreed to let us handle this internally first." The mention of police made Richard Sullivan's bluster deflate slightly. Criminal charges would be a public relations nightmare for his business and his family's reputation in the community. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone shifting from aggressive to calculating. "I want your son to understand that his actions have consequences," Dr. Harrison replied. "Real consequences that can't be bought or influenced away. He's suspended for 2 weeks minimum, banned from all extracurricular activities for the rest of the semester, and required to complete community service hours at a local nonprofit that serves underprivileged youth." Marcus looked up sharply at the last requirement. "Community service? Where?" "The Riverside Community Center," Dr. Harrison said, consulting her notes. "Ms. Mitchell suggested it. Apparently they run after-school programs for children from low-income families. You'll be helping with tutoring and mentoring. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Marcus would be spending his weekends working with kids who looked more like Brittany than like him, learning firsthand about the communities and experiences he'd been so quick to dismiss. "This is ridiculous," Richard Sullivan protested. "We'll sue the school. We'll have your job." Dr. Harrison stood up slowly, her full height and authority on display. "Mr. Sullivan, you're welcome to try, but I'd suggest you consider how a lawsuit would look in the papers. Wealthy family sues school for disciplining son who assaulted scholarship student. Is that really the headline you want associated with your business?" The threat was implicit but clear. Richard Sullivan's construction company depended on public contracts and community goodwill. A high-profile legal battle over his son's bullying of a black scholarship student would be a public relations disaster that could cost him millions. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, "but this doesn't end here. The board will hear about this." "I'm sure they will," Dr. Harrison replied calmly. "And I'm sure they'll be very interested in the video evidence and the documentation of ongoing harassment that preceded this incident." As the Sullivans left the office, Marcus casting one last resentful look at Brittany, Dr. Harrison turned her attention to the real victim in the situation. "Ms. Mitchell, I owe you an apology," she said sincerely. "The harassment you documented should have been addressed weeks ago. We failed in our duty to provide you with a safe learning environment." Brittany nodded graciously. "Thank you for saying that. I hope this means things will be different going forward." "They will be," Dr. Harrison promised. "We're implementing new anti-bullying protocols immediately, and I'm assigning a counselor to check in with you regularly to make sure you feel safe and supported here." As Brittany left the office to return to class, she could feel the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders. The immediate confrontation was over, but she knew this was just the beginning. The Sullivan family wouldn't give up easily, and Marcus would be back in 2 weeks with 2 weeks' worth of resentment and humiliation to work through. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving at Lincoln Prep, a sense of belonging. For the first time, the administration had taken her side, had listened to her concerns, and had held a privileged student accountable for his actions. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. As she walked through the hallways, Brittany noticed that other students were looking at her differently. Some with respect, others with curiosity, a few with barely concealed hostility. But none of them looked at her with the dismissive indifference she'd grown accustomed to. She was no longer invisible, no longer someone who could be safely ignored or casually mistreated. The news of Marcus's suspension spread through the school like wildfire, reaching every corner of Lincoln Prep within hours. By the end of the day, 3 different versions of the story were circulating, each one growing more dramatic in the telling. But the core facts remained consistent. The king of Lincoln Prep had been dethroned by a scholarship student who refused to be intimidated. Some students celebrated the outcome, seeing it as long overdue justice for Marcus's years of bullying and entitlement. Others worried about what it meant for the established social order, wondering if their own behavior might come under scrutiny now that someone had actually faced consequences for crossing the line. But perhaps most importantly, several students who had been quietly enduring their own harassment found the courage to speak up. By the end of the week, Dr. Harrison's office had received reports about incidents involving Marcus's friends, other students who had felt empowered by his example, and a pattern of behavior that went far deeper than anyone had realized. The video of the confrontation, despite efforts to keep it contained, found its way onto social media, where it quickly went viral. The sight of a young black woman calmly defending herself against a privileged white bully resonated with viewers across the country, sparking conversations about racism, privilege, and the right to self-defense. Brittany found herself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight, with requests for interviews and speaking engagements that she politely declined. She hadn't stood up to Marcus to become famous or to make a political statement. She'd simply refused to let someone take something precious from her, and everything else had followed from that simple act of self-respect. But as the weeks passed and Marcus remained suspended, Brittany began to understand that her actions had implications far beyond her own situation. Other students approached her with their own stories of harassment and discrimination, looking to her as someone who had proven that fighting back was possible. The scholarship that had brought her to Lincoln Prep had been intended to give her access to better educational opportunities. But in the end, the most valuable lesson she learned there had nothing to do with academics. She learned that standing up for yourself, even when it's scary and difficult and potentially costly, was sometimes the only way to preserve your dignity and self-respect. And as she touched her grandmother's cross necklace, still hanging safely around her neck where it belonged, Brittany knew that Mama Rose would have been proud of the young woman she was becoming. Strong enough to bend without breaking, smart enough to pick her battles, and brave enough to stand up when it mattered most. The 2 weeks of Marcus's suspension passed slowly, marked by a strange peace that settled over Lincoln Prep. Without his presence and the constant undercurrent of intimidation he'd created, other students began to relax, to speak more freely, to take up space they'd previously ceded to his influence. But Brittany knew that peace was temporary. Marcus would be back, and when he returned, he'd be angrier, more resentful, and potentially more dangerous than before. The real test of whether anything had truly changed at Lincoln Prep was still to come. Marcus Sullivan's return to Lincoln Preparatory Academy after his 2-week suspension was met with an atmosphere of electric tension that seemed to crackle through every hallway and classroom. Students whispered in hushed tones as he walked past, their conversations dying abruptly when he came within earshot. The confident swagger that had once characterized his movement through the school was notably absent, replaced by a rigid posture that spoke of barely controlled anger and wounded pride. The mandatory community service at Riverside Community Center had not humbled Marcus as Dr. Harrison had hoped. Instead, it had fed his resentment, providing him with what he saw as daily confirmation that he was being punished for defending the natural order of things. Spending his weekends tutoring children from low-income families had only reinforced his belief that there were fundamental differences between people like him and people like Brittany Mitchell, differences that money and privilege had rightfully recognized and rewarded. His first day back began with a mandatory meeting with Dr. Harrison and the school counselor, Mrs. Rebecca Torres, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s who specialized in behavioral intervention. The principal's office felt different to Marcus now, less like a sanctuary where problems got solved in his favor, and more like a courtroom where his every action would be scrutinized and judged. "Marcus," Dr. Harrison began, her tone professional but wary, "before you return to regular classes, we need to discuss your reintegration plan and the conditions of your continued enrollment here." Mrs. Torres leaned forward slightly, her expression carefully neutral. "How are you feeling about coming back? I imagine the past 2 weeks have given you time to reflect on what happened." Marcus had prepared for this question during the long, sleepless nights, when social media notifications reminded him that the video of his humiliation was still circulating, still being shared and commented on by strangers who didn't understand the context of what had really happened that day. "I've learned a lot," he said carefully, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "About myself and about how my actions affect others." It was the response his father's expensive lawyer had coached him to give, designed to sound contrite without admitting legal liability. But sitting across from Dr. Harrison, who had watched the video dozens of times and reviewed every piece of documentation Brittany had compiled, the words felt hollow and performative. "What specifically have you learned?" Mrs. Torres pressed gently. Marcus felt trapped by the question, knowing that anything too honest would sound like he was making excuses, while anything too rehearsed would ring false. "I learned that my behavior was inappropriate and that I need to respect other students' boundaries." Dr. Harrison and Mrs. Torres exchanged a glance that Marcus didn't miss. They weren't buying it, weren't satisfied with his carefully constructed non-apology, but they also couldn't prove that his remorse wasn't genuine based on words alone. "Your continued enrollment here is conditional," Dr. Harrison stated firmly. "Any further incidents involving harassment, intimidation, or physical contact with other students will result in immediate expulsion. There will be no warnings, no second chances, no calls to your father's lawyer. Do you understand?" The threat hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt the weight of how completely his position at the school had changed. 2 weeks ago, he had been untouchable, protected by his family's wealth and influence. Now he was being treated like a common delinquent, subject to rules and consequences that had never applied to him before. "I understand," he said, though what he really understood was that his world had been fundamentally altered by 30 seconds of video that would follow him for the rest of his life. When Marcus finally made it to his first class, Advanced Calculus with Mr. Peterson, the reaction from his classmates was immediate and uncomfortable. Some students avoided eye contact entirely, while others stared with undisguised curiosity. The easy camaraderie he'd once enjoyed with his peers had evaporated, replaced by a social distance that felt almost physical. Jake Morrison and Dylan Pierce, his former closest allies, had positioned themselves strategically across the room from where Marcus usually sat. Their defection during his suspension had been swift and calculated, driven by their parents' advice to distance themselves from the Sullivan family until the controversy died down. In the cruel mathematics of teenage social hierarchies, loyalty was always secondary to self-preservation. But it was seeing Brittany Mitchell in advanced literature during third period that truly tested Marcus's ability to maintain the facade of reformed behavior that his return required. She sat in the front row as she had since her first day at Lincoln Prep, taking careful notes as Mrs. Patterson discussed themes of social justice in Harper Lee's novel. She looked completely at ease, as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't single-handedly destroyed the social order that had defined Marcus's entire existence. The rational part of Marcus's mind understood that Brittany had simply defended herself against his own aggressive behavior. But the wounded, prideful part of him couldn't accept that narrative, couldn't reconcile it with everything he'd been taught about his place in the world and the deference he was owed by virtue of his family's position in the community. As Mrs. Patterson led a discussion about how privilege and prejudice intersected in the novel, Marcus found himself studying Brittany's profile, noting the confident way she raised her hand to contribute to the conversation, the respectful attention other students paid to her insights. She had become, in the weeks since their confrontation, something he had never expected: genuinely popular. "Miss Mitchell," Mrs. Patterson said, "you've been quite thoughtful about the ways that Atticus Finch's character has been reevaluated by modern readers. Can you expand on that?" Brittany's response was articulate and nuanced, demonstrating not just intelligence but wisdom beyond her years. She talked about the difference between performative allyship and genuine solidarity, about how good intentions without action were insufficient to address systemic injustice. As she spoke, Marcus noticed other students leaning forward, engaged and interested in what she had to say. It was a stark contrast to the way conversations had gone when Marcus dominated classroom discussions. His contributions had been technically correct but intellectually lazy, relying on his confidence and social position rather than genuine insight or preparation. Watching Brittany command respect through the quality of her thoughts rather than the weight of her family name was both humbling and infuriating. During lunch, Marcus sat alone for the first time in his academic career. The table where he'd once held court was now occupied by a group of sophomore theater students who didn't even glance in his direction. The cafeteria's social geography had shifted completely in his absence, and there was no obvious place for him in the new configuration. He was picking at his food and trying to look like the isolation was a choice rather than a consequence when Brittany approached his table. She moved with the same calm confidence she'd displayed during their confrontation, carrying her tray with steady hands and meeting his gaze directly. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, though she was already pulling out the chair across from him. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, uncertain whether this was some kind of trap or test designed to provoke him into another incident that would justify his expulsion. "It's a free country," he said, echoing her words from that day in the hallway. Brittany sat down and opened her milk carton with careful precision before speaking. "How was community service?" The question caught Marcus off guard with its directness. He'd expected taunting or confrontation, not what sounded like genuine curiosity about his court-mandated volunteer work. "Educational," he said finally, unsure how honest he wanted to be with someone he still considered an enemy. "The kids at Riverside are pretty amazing," Brittany continued conversationally. "I used to volunteer there before I started at Lincoln Prep. Some of them are smarter than half the students here, they just haven't had the same opportunities." Marcus stared at her, processing this information and what it implied about her motivations for suggesting that particular community service assignment. She hadn't chosen Riverside randomly or vindictively. She'd chosen it because she believed it would genuinely teach him something important. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Brittany took a bite of her sandwich and chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Because I think you might actually learn something if you let yourself. Those kids don't care about your last name or your parents' money. They just care about whether you show up and try to help them with their homework." It was true, Marcus realized with uncomfortable clarity. The children at Riverside had treated him with a mixture of skepticism and hope that had nothing to do with his social status. They'd evaluated him based solely on his willingness to be patient with their questions and encouraging about their efforts. Some of them had reminded him of his younger sister before his family's wealth had insulated her from any real challenges or consequences. "Look," Brittany continued. "I'm not here to gloat or to pretend we're going to be friends, but I also don't want to spend the next 2 years watching you plot some kind of revenge that's just going to get you expelled and ruin your future." Marcus felt his defensive walls rising. "What makes you think I'm plotting anything?" "Because I've been watching you since you got back," Brittany said simply. "And you look like someone who's spending more energy on being angry than on figuring out how to move forward." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Marcus had spent most of his suspension fantasizing about ways to regain his social position and make Brittany pay for her role in his downfall. The idea of simply accepting what had happened and working to rebuild his reputation through positive actions had barely occurred to him. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of exhaustion that surprised them both. "I want you to stop seeing this as something that happened to you and start seeing it as something you did to yourself," Brittany replied without hesitation. "I want you to understand that having money and connections doesn't give you the right to treat other people like they're less than human." Marcus felt anger flare in his chest, hot and familiar. "You don't know anything about my life or what I've been through." "You're right," Brittany agreed readily. "I don't know what it's like to grow up with your advantages, but I do know what it's like to be treated like I don't belong somewhere, like I should be grateful for whatever scraps of respect people decide to throw my way." She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes intense and focused. "The difference is, when people treat me that way, it's because of things I can't control. My skin color, my family's income, the neighborhood I grew up in. When people started treating you differently, it was because of choices you made. That's actually good news, because it means you can make different choices." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ashley Chen, the sophomore who had recorded the original confrontation. She approached their table hesitantly, clutching her lunch tray and looking uncertain about whether she should interrupt. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said to Brittany, "but I wanted to thank you for something." Brittany gestured to an empty chair. "What for?" Ashley sat down carefully, glancing nervously at Marcus before focusing on Brittany. "My little brother goes to Roosevelt Middle School, and he was having problems with some 8th graders who kept stealing his lunch money. After he saw that video of you standing up to Marcus, he decided to report it to his teachers instead of just accepting it." Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment as Ashley continued. "The Bullies got suspended, and now Tommy feels safe going to school again. He keeps talking about how that girl at Lincoln Prep showed him that he didn't have to just take it when people were mean to him." Brittany smiled warmly at Ashley, but Marcus could see that she was also uncomfortable with being cast as some kind of hero. "I'm glad your brother is okay. That took courage, reporting what was happening." "He said he learned it from watching you," Ashley replied. "That sometimes standing up for yourself is scary, but it's better than letting people walk all over you." After Ashley left to join her friends at another table, Marcus and Brittany sat in silence for several minutes. The weight of understanding what his actions had represented, not just to Brittany, but to everyone who had witnessed them, settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders. "I never thought about it like that," he said finally. "Like, what?" "Like, other people might be watching and learning from what we do. I just thought about what I wanted in the moment." Brittany nodded slowly. "That's the thing about privilege. When you have it, you get to think about yourself first, because you assume someone else will handle the bigger picture. But when you don't have it, you're always aware that your actions might affect other people who look like you or come from where you come from." Marcus found himself thinking about the children at Riverside Community Center, about the way they had watched him during his first few visits to see whether he was going to treat them with respect or condescension. He'd initially been annoyed by their wariness, but now he understood that they'd been protecting themselves against the kind of casual cruelty that people like him often inflicted without even realizing it. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, the words coming out more vulnerable than he'd intended. "Start by actually listening to people, instead of just waiting for your turn to talk," Brittany suggested. "Stop assuming that your perspective is the only one that matters. And maybe consider that being wrong about something doesn't make you a bad person, but refusing to learn from being wrong definitely does." The remainder of the lunch period passed in thoughtful silence, both students lost in their own reflections about the conversation and what it meant for their relationship going forward. When the bell rang to signal the end of lunch, Marcus found himself walking beside Brittany toward their respective classes, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. "Brittany," he said as they reached the junction where their paths diverged, "I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not just because I got caught or because there were consequences, but because what I did was wrong." Brittany studied his face for a moment, looking for signs of sincerity or manipulation. "Apologies are just words, Marcus. What matters is what you do from here." As she walked away toward her advanced chemistry class, Marcus stood in the hallway watching her go and feeling something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine respect for someone he'd previously dismissed as beneath his notice. The realization was uncomfortable and humbling, but it was also the first step toward becoming the kind of person his community service supervisor at Riverside had suggested he might be capable of becoming. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Over the following weeks, Marcus struggled with the gap between his intellectual understanding of what needed to change and his emotional resistance to giving up the worldview that had shaped his entire identity. There were moments when his old arrogance reasserted itself, when he caught himself thinking that he was being unfairly persecuted for behavior that had been overlooked in countless other privileged students. But gradually, as he continued his community service work and began to genuinely engage with the children at Riverside rather than simply going through the motions, Marcus started to understand what Brittany had meant about learning to listen. The kids taught him things that no expensive private education had ever covered: how to be patient with someone who was struggling, how to celebrate small victories, how to show up consistently even when you didn't feel like it. One evening in late November, Marcus was helping a 10-year-old named Destiny with her math homework when she looked up at him with serious brown eyes and asked, "Why did you get in trouble at your school?" Marcus had been dreading this question since he started volunteering, knowing that the children would eventually hear about his suspension either from their older siblings or from overheard adult conversations. He'd prepared various deflections and explanations, but sitting across from Destiny, whose trust he'd been working to earn for weeks, he found himself telling the truth. "I was mean to another student," he said simply. "I tried to take something that belonged to her, and I thought I could get away with it because my family has more money than hers." Destiny considered this information with the seriousness that children brought to questions of fairness and justice. "That doesn't sound very nice." "It wasn't nice," Marcus agreed. "It was wrong, and I hurt her feelings, and I made other people feel unsafe." "Did you say sorry?" "I did, but saying sorry isn't enough if you don't change your behavior. That's why I'm here, learning how to be a better person." Destiny nodded sagely and returned to her multiplication problems, apparently satisfied with his explanation. But the conversation stayed with Marcus as he walked to his car that evening, thinking about how easily a child could cut through all the justifications and rationalizations to identify the simple truth of what he'd done wrong. When he arrived at school the next morning, Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the semester. He sought out Brittany between classes and asked if she would be willing to help him organize a fundraiser for Riverside Community Center. "They need new computers for their after-school program," he explained, "and I think some of the families here might be willing to donate if they understood how much good the center does for local kids." Brittany looked surprised but not suspicious. "Why do you want to do this?" "Because those kids deserve better resources than they have," Marcus said honestly. "And because I want to do something positive instead of just serving time until my community service hours are completed." The fundraiser became a turning point for both students and for Lincoln Prep as a whole. Working together to organize the event, Marcus and Brittany discovered that they had complementary skills and perspectives that made them an effective team. Marcus understood how to navigate the social and political dynamics of the school's wealthy families, while Brittany brought genuine passion for the cause and deep knowledge of the community they were trying to help. More importantly, their collaboration sent a powerful message to other students about the possibility of redemption and growth. If Marcus Sullivan could acknowledge his mistakes and work to make amends, if Brittany Mitchell could forgive someone who had wronged her and work toward positive change, then perhaps the rigid social hierarchies that had defined their school for so long weren't as immutable as everyone had believed. The fundraiser exceeded all expectations, raising enough money not just for new computers, but for upgraded internet access and additional programming supplies. But the real success was measured in the relationships that formed between Lincoln Prep students and Riverside Community Center children, ongoing mentoring partnerships that continued long after Marcus had completed his mandated community service hours. On the night of the fundraiser celebration, as Marcus watched Brittany laughing with a group of Riverside kids who had come to thank their new mentors, he realized that the person he tried to diminish and control had actually saved him from becoming someone he would have eventually despised. The necklace he'd tried to take from her had become a symbol not of his power over others, but of her refusal to let anyone reduce her to less than she was. As winter break approached and the events of that day in the hallway began to feel like ancient history, Marcus found himself grateful for the humiliation that had forced him to confront the ugliness in his own character. The video that had once filled him with shame now served as a reminder of how far he'd come and how much further he still had to go in becoming the kind of person who deserved the privileges he'd been born with. The transformation wasn't complete, and probably never would be. But it was real, built on the foundation of genuine remorse, and sustained by the ongoing work of earning redemption through action rather than words. And it had all started with a young woman's refusal to let anyone take what rightfully belonged to her, no matter how much power they thought they wielded. 2 years later, Brittany Mitchell stood at the podium in Lincoln Preparatory Academy's grand auditorium, looking out at a sea of faces that had once seemed foreign and unwelcoming. As the student body president, she was delivering the commencement address for her graduating class, a moment that would have been unimaginable on that first day when she'd walked through the school's imposing gates, clutching her thrift store backpack. The gold cross necklace rested gently against her graduation gown, catching the stage lights as she adjusted the microphone. The same piece of jewelry that had sparked a confrontation which changed everything now served as a quiet reminder of how far she'd traveled, not just academically but personally. "When I first arrived at Lincoln Prep," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, "I thought success meant keeping my head down and proving I belonged here, through perfect grades and flawless behavior. I learned something different, that changed not just my own path, but the culture of our entire school." In the audience, her mother Sandra beamed with pride, having worked extra shifts for months to afford the professional camera she held, documenting every moment of her daughter's triumph. Uncle Jerome sat beside her, his military posture reflecting the satisfaction of a mentor who had taught someone not just to defend themselves, but to defend their principles. "I learned that belonging isn't something you earn by making yourself smaller," Brittany continued. "It's something you claim by standing tall and refusing to let anyone diminish your worth. Sometimes that means making difficult choices, taking stands that feel scary, and trusting that doing the right thing will create the right outcomes." Several rows back, Marcus Sullivan listened intently, his own cap and gown a stark reminder of how dramatically his trajectory had shifted. The young man who had once seen education as an entitlement now understood it as a responsibility. His acceptance to Columbia University hadn't come through family connections or athletic scholarships, but through essays about service and leadership that reflected genuine personal growth. The Riverside Community Center had become his second home over the past 2 years. What had started as court-mandated community service had evolved into a passion for educational equity that would define his college major and career aspirations. The children who had once intimidated him with their raw intelligence and resilience now inspired him to pursue social work, determined to expand opportunities for students who reminded him of his former self's dismissive assumptions. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Brittany said, her eyes scanning the audience and briefly meeting Marcus's gaze. "It happens through small daily choices to treat others with dignity, to listen before we speak, and to use whatever privileges we have in service of justice rather than personal advantage." Dr. Harrison, now in her final year as principal before retirement, felt a deep satisfaction watching these 2 students who had transformed not just their own lives but the entire school community. The anti-bullying initiatives that had emerged from their conflict had become a model for other institutions, and the mentorship program connecting Lincoln Prep students with Riverside Community Center had created lasting bonds across economic and racial lines. The disciplinary statistics told the story of cultural change. Harassment reports had dropped by 70%, not because fewer incidents were being reported, but because fewer incidents were occurring. Students had learned to see each other as individuals rather than representatives of social categories, and the toxic hierarchies that had once defined school life had given way to more collaborative and inclusive relationships. Today we graduate not just with diplomas, but with the knowledge that we have the power to shape the communities we enter, Brittany concluded. We've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in the presence of fear. We've discovered that real leadership means lifting others up rather than pushing them down. And we've proven that when we stand together, we can create change that seemed impossible when we stood alone. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes, with students, parents, and faculty recognizing not just the eloquence of her words but the authenticity of her journey. This was a young woman who had faced real adversity and emerged stronger, who had transformed opposition into opportunity, and who had created lasting positive change in her community. As the ceremony concluded and families gathered for photos and celebrations, Marcus approached Brittany near the stage. The interaction would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier, but now it felt natural, the product of genuine friendship forged through shared commitment to something larger than themselves. "Great speech," he said, his smile reflecting none of the artificial charm that had once characterized his social interactions. "You really captured what these years have meant." "We all played our parts," Brittany replied graciously, "including you. The person you've become is pretty incredible." Marcus felt the familiar tug of humility that still surprised him sometimes. "I had a good teacher. Several of them, actually. Starting with someone who refused to let me take what didn't belong to me." They were joined by Ashley Chen, now the incoming student body president who had organized a scholarship fund for students from underrepresented backgrounds. Her transformation from nervous sophomore to confident leader exemplified the ripple effects of that day in the hallway when one student's refusal to be diminished had given others permission to stand tall. "I wanted to thank you both," Ashley said, "for showing us what real leadership looks like. The scholarship fund has already raised enough money to support 3 students next year, and we're planning to expand the mentorship program to include middle school students too." The legacy was already visible in the incoming freshman class, which was more diverse and better supported than any in Lincoln Prep's history. The admissions process had been revised to consider not just academic achievement, but potential for growth and contribution to school culture. The orientation program now included sessions on respect, inclusivity, and conflict resolution, ensuring that future students would begin their journey with tools for building community rather than enforcing hierarchy. As the graduation celebration wound down and families began to disperse, Brittany found herself standing alone in the auditorium where she delivered her address. The empty seats seemed to hold echoes of conversations and conflicts that had shaped her high school experience, but the dominant feeling was one of gratitude rather than resentment. Uncle Jerome appeared beside her, his pride evident in the way he stood a little taller in his best suit. "Your grandmother would be so proud," he said quietly, "not just of your grades or your achievements, but of the woman you've become." Brittany touched the cross necklace, feeling the familiar weight of love and legacy that had carried her through the most challenging moments of her journey. "I hope I've honored her memory. Baby girl, you've done more than honor it. You've extended it, passed it on to others who needed to see what standing up for yourself looks like. That's the kind of inheritance that keeps growing long after the person who gave it is gone." As they walked together toward the parking lot where her mother waited with the car, Brittany reflected on the unexpected turns her story had taken. She'd come to Lincoln Prep seeking educational opportunities, but she'd found something more valuable: the knowledge that she had the power to shape her environment rather than simply adapt to it. The video of her confrontation with Marcus had long since faded from social media attention, replaced by newer controversies and viral moments. But the lessons it had taught, the conversations it had started, and the changes it had catalyzed continued to influence lives in ways that couldn't be measured by view counts or likes. Her acceptance to Harvard University represented the culmination of years of academic excellence, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in her commitment to justice and equity. The pre-law program she'd chosen would prepare her for a career in civil rights law, using the legal system to protect others who faced the kind of discrimination and harassment she had experienced. Marcus's path to Columbia would take him in a different direction, toward social work and community organizing, but their shared commitment to service meant their paths would likely cross again in the future. The friendship they'd built through their mutual growth had become one of the most meaningful relationships of their high school years. Proof that people could change and that redemption was possible when it was earned through consistent action rather than empty promises. The other students who had been transformed by witnessing their conflict and reconciliation were now carrying those lessons forward to their own colleges and communities. Some had become advocates for educational equity, others had chosen careers in social justice, and still others had simply committed to treating everyone they encountered with dignity and respect. The small gold cross that had started it all continued to rest against Brittany's heart, a tangible reminder of the love that had sustained her through difficult times and the strength that had enabled her to stand up for what was right. As she climbed into her mother's car for the ride home, she knew that Mama Rosa's legacy would continue to guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The transformation that had begun with a single moment of refusal to be diminished had rippled outward in ways that would be felt for generations. Students who had learned to stand up for themselves and others, administrators who had discovered the importance of addressing systemic inequities, and parents who had been forced to confront their own biases and assumptions about privilege and power. Lincoln Preparatory Academy would remember this graduating class not just for their academic achievements, but for their role in creating a more just and inclusive community. The girl who had walked through those gates 2 years earlier with nothing but determination and her grandmother's necklace had left behind a legacy of courage, compassion, and change that would outlive any individual accomplishment. And in the end, that was the most important lesson of all, that one person's refusal to accept injustice, one moment of standing up for what's right, could create waves of transformation that would reach far beyond anything they could have imagined when they first found the courage to say no to someone who tried to take what didn't belong to them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.